Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So we are going to be revisiting Ibispaint today as the title suggests. So I have not really used Ibispaint in a very long time, and if we looked at my most recent drawings that I've done on here, which happens to be the sketch page, it's been well over a year since I've used Ibispaint, and I've briefly talked about this in I think a few other videos alongside with a few streams before, that Ibispaint isn't technically my main drawing program by any means, nor is it a program that I use to draw just like in general. I mostly use it only to draw for videos, so if you do want me to use it more frequently, definitely let me know and I'll start to kind of like incorporate it back into kind of like my drawing flow every so often. But for the most part, because I don't use it like as my main drawing program, I haven't touched it since the last time I did a video about it. So before we get actually into the drawing portion, I wanted to show you guys my pressure sensitivity graph, or like my I guess like my settings for it, because I usually get questions about it as like certain brushes don't behave the same way for you or for other artists. So it also probably went by quickly, but I also turn off the quick eyedropper tool, as I usually find it a little bit annoying to have that toggled on when I'm doing the sketching portion. I'm going to watch the ad off screen, so I'm going to go ahead and do that and have access to the free brushes. But in the meantime, you guys can download any of my brushes right here. Now, these ones are going to be slightly different compared to the ones you've probably seen in the previous video where I talked about making custom Ibispaint brushes. And the reason being is that I was kind of like fiddling around with some of the settings, because there was something that I have had struggled a little bit on Ibispaint, which I don't really like. But let me talk about who we're drawing first, and then I'll jump back into that really quickly. We are going to be doing more fan art of Reverse 1999 characters, and today, I believe you pronounce her name as Semmelweis. I do apologize if that's not how you say it, but I'm going to refer to her as that throughout the video. I really love her design a whole lot, and I just love the splash art for her, so I wanted to do a little bit of fan art today and kind of keep it a little bit easier for me to get kind of like jump back into this program a little bit. I usually think like once you're used to just doing like digital art in general, it's kind of easy to kind of like skip around between different programs, but you do find small things you might have to tweak or adjust or try to get used to. So right off the bat, I ended up changing the canvas color to not be a striking white as usual. I've also set my sketching color to be kind of like a similar purple that I use in Procreate, but the settings that are kind of changed on my brushes from the previous video till now. So if you downloaded my previous brushes before, I highly recommend updating them if you can, or just trying them out to see whether or not you like these ones a little bit better. It's mainly one specific setting that's changed, which I think in different programs, it might be like brush density or the amount of paint, because in Procreate, one of the sliding bars that you have on there is obviously like the brush size, which you can toggle, or not like toggle, I guess like slide up and down. And then the bar below it is, I'm assuming it's called opacity, but I'm not too sure if it is per se. I feel like it's a little bit more linked towards like pressure opacity or like amount of paint, or even like the brush density, but allows me to get a little bit more range out of my brushes sometimes. So I'm able to use a little bit less pressure, get lots of like more softer, more translucent of a look on my brush, versus like pressing a little bit harder, I can kind of get more of a sharper edge or more of an opaque look. Now, this can be probably adjusted in the brush itself, but I oftentimes, whenever using like a painting brush of any sort, I tend to lower down that bar to about maybe like 80 to 90%, so it's like never hovering at the very top. But for the brushes that I've been using for sketching, rendering, and painting on Ibispaint, I've mostly used the colored pencil because it kind of gave me the same look of what I wanted, but it never gave me the exact same feeling, and it has a little bit of like tooth and texture, which I didn't mind in the beginning. But when I was replicating a lot of the brushes that I like to use on like Procreate onto Ibispaint, I did find that there is a little bit still of that not like having the ability to be able to go like super light and have like a very soft kind of stroke, versus like immediately trying to put down a stroke and it kind of like puts down a very harsh amount of paint in my opinion. Also, progress-wise, I did do a rough sketch and then a more kind of like detailed sketch, which I'm kind of working on right now. I did end up struggling on the hand quite a bit, so that's why I put it in time lapse so you can kind of see all the iterations I do kind of for her fingers until I finally settle with a pose. But I believe when I was working on like doing the painting, I did go back and forth and fiddle with the one setting, which I think in Ibispaint it is called pressure opacity. But for me, the slider does not really make sense. A lot of the sliders that I've seen always go from 0 to 100 or 0 to a higher number. So usually like past 0, you can kind of get like a none or like an option that has it not in effect. But then you can set it to 0 or like a low number, usually let's say on a opacity scale. If you have it closer to 0, the more transparent, translucent it's gonna look. And then the more we increase it to 100, it will be more opaque, so you can't really see through it. But me adjusting the slider with the pressure opacity, I had a harder time figuring out what exactly does it do. I believe 0 is in the center and the number can go into the negatives or up to 100. Now, I initially did the slider all the way to the left or like pretty close to like maybe a quarter into the left or something like that. So to kind of see whether or not the brush behaves in a way. And I thought it behaved a little bit more towards my liking. So having that softer edge and be able to have a lighter application. So at this point when you're seeing like when I'm filling in Semmelweis's hair, it kind of is more of like a fairly opaque kind of like very abrupt looking brush, and usually when I'm doing even just like the base colors and stuff like that, I tend to use something like of a softer brush. But right here I think is like when I'm still not really fiddling with the setting until we actually do more of like the painting portion. So a lot of the marks in the beginning are not going to look super soft unless I'm making my brush super big. But after I fiddled around a little bit more, I changed the pressure opacity to closer to 100. So sliding the pressure opacity closer to the right side. And I think it gave me the desired effect that I liked a little bit more. You can kind of see me here kind of like fiddling around and going through the options to see whether or not I found something that worked. And I hopefully think I found it to be a little bit closer to what I wanted. If anybody knows maybe a video or a guide that kind of like explains the settings for brushes, please let me know. Or if you know how to explain how exactly the pressure opacity works in the Ibispaint kind of like brush settings, do let me know, because I do find it a little bit difficult for some, I guess like brush making and stuff, to get that kind of effect to work out for the brush unless I'm like trying to fiddle around with the colored pencil, which I kind of feel like already has that feeling, and I could just like take the texture off and like fiddle around with some other settings, which I don't remember if that's how I initially made my painting brush, but maybe I'll fiddle around a little bit more in the future if I end up using Ibispaint again. But I believe for all three of my brushes, so the ones that I showed you guys with the QR codes near the beginning is a sketch brush, a painting brush, and the brush that I like to use for rendering. So sketch brush is probably, I would have been fine using the colored pencil or some kind of like pencil type of brush. But the one that I'm currently using, or at least like before I started to fiddle around with the settings, I think, it does feel a little bit like it stops and starts a little bit too abruptly, like I mentioned earlier, which is kind of why I feel like some of the brushes in Procreate, or like the default brushes, I guess, have a little bit more of that natural feeling towards working traditionally versus working digitally. And as a person who has like more of a traditional art background at the very beginning, I do appreciate having those little settings that you can kind of tweak to make it feel a little bit more like traditional medium, versus like some of the tools just feel like a little bit too jarring for me, which I feel like might depend on your style as well. I do a little bit more of like mixing and painting when I do coloring, so the sketch portion isn't too much like a hit or miss in terms of like needing to get that kind of like out of the way. But whenever I do like the painting portion and I feel like I'm struggling with trying to achieve a certain kind of look in a very similar manner, that's when I needed to fiddle like right away with the coloring portion and like fixing the brush to my liking. But let's talk a little bit more about process-wise. And I do apologize if none of that made sense. Basically, I would like to have a deeper understanding of like the Ibispaint brush mechanics and settings so that I can make a brush that suits my needs. I struggle with this in Clip Studio Paint as well, but I do have like my favorite brushes on there too that I don't think make me feel like I want to like keep fiddling with settings, if that makes sense. But let me get back on track a little bit here. So for the coloring portion, when I was doing the base layer after I did the background color, I alpha locked it and added in all of my rough colors. After that, you can see that I had like a bunch of different effect layers. So I'm using a lot of blend modes to kind of adjust the colors to my liking. I had an add layer to add a little bit of rim lighting or just like a brighter light source. I added a multiply layer to add a shadow right under her chin on some strands of her hair to push it back a little bit more and to kind of like separate some of the pieces so we have a little bit more depth in it, as well as adding a general overlay layer over everything so that we can adjust a bit of the hue in her hair color. So Semmelweis has more of a like white, I guess like a bright white. I believe she's a vampire, so kind of like white hair, bright red eyes when she's kind of in her like blood moon phase thing. So I don't know, I just really wanted to draw her. So, and white hair or like black are kind of like some of the things I love to render quite a bit. So she has black, kind of like a top, as well as like darker mesh-ish looking kind of sleeves. So it's very fun to kind of push and pull some of the hues that I could place into it, as well as the hair. So at the very beginning, when I showed her kind of like splash art, this is what I really like. If you have any sort of like inspiration from like other artists or anything, I highly recommend just like doing a deep dive on like the color usage that they have or something like that, because the one thing I really love about Semmelweis's like splash art the most is kind of like the colors that they placed for the lighting of her hair alongside with the choices for her outfit. So she has kind of more of a deeper, almost like foresty green, or kind of like a combination of forest green and kind of like an emerald green dress, but she has like bright pops of red, which I did not get the opportunity to really use because of how awkwardly I cropped our pose here, which I ended up switching her pose. I was gonna do more of a foreshortened one so you could see more of her dress and then have that contrast, but in the end I thought it would be easier for me to just do something a little bit more simple, and I kind of wanted to just focus on her hair. And the thing I love about what they did with her hair is that in the kind of like shadows alongside with the lighting, you get to see a lot of like color shifts into almost like a minty teal green-ish kind of color. There's a little bit of warmth from the red, and I tried my best to incorporate a little bit of that color scheme back into my own piece because I love the combination of like teal and red, or like green and red, kind of like a navy and red also looks really nice, or like a peach color with a kind of like bluish green also looks great. I think because I was more focused on how to like render the hair and stuff, I definitely put my most like amount of energy into that. I did do something a little bit awkward in terms of like the placement of these little beads that are in her hair. So for me, I had them spaced out in a certain kind of way, very kind of like vaguely placed, and I kind of just ended up using the placement for the final. But when I was looking at the actual reference photo, which is like the splash art or like the official art, it had the beads a little bit closer, so I decided to fill in the gaps. But now looking at like the final drawing, I missed rendering one bead, as well as I did not fix the placement of another one that's near the top of her head, so it kind of looks like it's out of place quite a bit, and I do think I might go back and like kind of fix that up. But just like in general, I don't think in previous sessions I gave Ibispaint like as fair of a chance in terms of working in it. I don't think the one that I did of Semmelweis today has been like my longest session, but I definitely did everything I did similarly to my process in Procreate. So in the other sessions, I think I've done a start to finish of Ningguang, I believe, and like I think I did an ASMR session of Tinari as well from Genshin Impact, and for those ones I've mostly used like the colored pencil, and I feel like I was like restricting myself a little bit, and sometimes when I record videos to kind of like shorten the length of the amount of footage I have, I skip out on some of like my own process and stuff. So I definitely think this was like a better shot at using Ibis paint compared to before. Even though like the other times I did try, but I definitely got burnt out a little bit quicker compared to this one. This one I just had a lot of fun just drawing her. Also, I guess another part that definitely makes me feel a little bit more motivated is that whenever I get into a new fandom of any other sort and it has like beautiful art or just like the characters or something, I get really into it. So I've been just like really enamored by the different artwork or just like the rendering, the painterliness, the backgrounds, all that stuff that's in Reverse 1999. I highly recommend you guys take a look at the artwork at least. I'm not making you guys take a look at the game if you don't want to play a never gotcha game, but I've been really enjoying it and I've been taking my time playing through the story and learning the gameplay and all that stuff. But I absolutely like adore the characters quite a bit, personality wise, the voiceover, both in like I use like the English and the JP dub kind of like on and off, but the characters are just like, at least to me, so lovable, and I love just looking at the art and like live 2 rigging. The thing I love about being able to look at the characters in kind of like your, I guess like your menu where it can kind of show you their stats and stuff, is that you get to look at their overall kind of like static art as well as the rigged live 2D version, which I love seeing, and you can kind of zoom in and check everything out. And the last thing you can do is also switch it to the illustration portion. So I love doing that and being able to kind of like see the differences in between like the different art styles, as well as just like the way how they render clothes or like the way they do hair. I love seeing. So it's kind of nice in comparison. Like I mostly looked at like Genshin Impact art or like Honkai Star Rail art, and it's very like clean and crisp and like, very particular looking in my opinion. And when I'm talking about these games, it's kind of more in like recent years that I've been looking at their stuff, because obviously that's when the games came out, and then I became very invested into the fandom, the story, the characters and all that. But looking at Reverse 1999, I feel like the art direction is very different in a way. So the characters often are, I believe they all look cohesive in their own way, but they all have their little things that make them very different. And I don't know, maybe it's just me. I can't stop gushing about the characters in that game so much. So at least if you're an artist or anything, or just like pretty art, definitely take a look at some of the characters and stuff from Reverse 1999. I highly recommend it just because I don't think any of you guys would be disappointed in looking at just how gorgeous the art and like how well done the rigging is, and the voice acting is very charming. So yeah. Kind of back to the process. One thing I do like more so in Ibispaint compared to Procreate, I believe, is their reference window. I don't know why, it just feels a little bit more clean and crisp compared to the one in Procreate, as well as I do like being able to see the kind of like, how do I explain this? There's like a little box within the reference window that shows you exactly where you're zoomed in on, kind of like as a navigator. And I do like being able to see that, and I don't know, it makes it a little bit easier when I get into like the nitty-gritty details of everything, and it just makes sure that I have a good overview of everything, but I also just can make sure where I am on my canvas, and I can kind of keep track of it a little bit easier. The one on Procreate, I don't know, it makes it look a little bit fuzzy at times, I think. Maybe it's just me not using it too frequently, but I think for something like this where I am doing more details up close, it's definitely good to have an overall look at your artwork so that you don't get too bogged down on doing details that don't make sense or don't really contribute to the final image, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's just kind of nice that they had a reference window like this, and it just made it very easy for me to work on the entire piece of Semmelweis. But if you guys want me to use Ibispaint in the future again, I will definitely consider it. I think at this point, at least like how I've done Semmelweis, I can probably go back and forth, maybe doing Ibispaint every so often and go back to Procreate. Before, I always didn't like how I drew in Ibispaint. Maybe it was because I was using a particular brush, like I said, with like the colored pencil, that it does give me a little bit of a different finish. So oftentimes I don't really use those artwork for anything. It was just kind of like for the video. But if it's something you guys really want to see, then I'll definitely bring it back and work in it, because I know some people prefer watching artists that use the same art program as they do. It's probably easier to relate, or you want to pick up on different habits or like see different tips and tricks that they use. So it might be easier for you to apply it to your own artwork. And with that being said, I did end up duplicating my layers, placing it on top of my original 2 layers, so like my background and my Semmelweis layer. And then I ended up merging the 2 copies that I had and then Gaussian blurring it a little bit, erasing to where I wanted the focus to be, added a little bit of like dust particles here and there for the lighting and all that. But then after I fought, it did not give me the same feeling that I wanted. So I ended up adding I believe it's an add layer on top of her eyes to make them glow a little bit. And then I added an extra multiply layer, and I will adjust the colors to be a little bit more moodier. And then I will also use the eraser tool to kind of erase our kind of like bluish purple lighting that we had, or like shadows that we had initially, until I think the colors look okay. One last thing I wanted to do is add an overlay layer over the top of like everything. I will lower the opacity, and then we can kind of do a little bit of color adjustments into her hair or her lighting or anything like that at the very end. Now, speaking about the end, we are finished with the drawing of Semmelweis, and I actually really like this one. I think it actually turned out pretty clean in terms of how I usually work. There are some things I probably will fix up and might redo just in case I want to use this artwork for something else. Like I mentioned, there's a bead that I missed rendering, as well as a bead that looks out of place on her head. But as usual, I am going to be showing you guys kind of like the time lapse. So according to Ibispaint, the overall work time is 3 hours and 39 minutes. But I think this also counts in like my weird pauses. Like if I'm sitting and I have the canvas open and I'm like looking something up on my phone, I believe that counts towards my time. But if you looked at like the top left corner of my iPad, you can kind of see that it took me kind of like 2 days in terms of like the sessions. So I kind of split it up and I kind of work on it on and off. I thought I was going to end the video right here, but I ended up going back into my gallery and showing you guys the other illustration that I made using the same brushes that I made for that video. So I believe that one is of the one of my OC Maseki right here. And it kind of has a similar finish, but there's just something off about it that I don't really like. So I definitely think there is a little bit more of me getting comfortable using Ibispaint once again, that it makes me like this one of Semmelweis a little bit more. But kind of with everything out of the way, alongside with the time lapse and everything, I think that's it for today's video. So I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!